Hi guys, welcome to Chaos Makers Hobby House. My name is Alexandra, and today I want to talk about succession planning because, well, it's that time of year. So I garden in South Carolina at Zone 8B, and here it is already extraordinarily hot. It is brutal and has been for over a month now. Some crops, they just don't do well in the heat. So you start out the beginning of the year with all your garden beds or your plots filled with plants. Everything is so densely packed in, producing like crazy, looks amazing. And as the heat picks up, things start to not produce as much. They start to die back. They start to succumb to pest and disease pressure. And then you also have those crops that are one and done kind of crops, like corn. Once you harvest corn, you've got an empty garden plot. So what are you supposed to do with them? And then you have things like cucumbers. They just can't take the heat. They get really bitter when it gets too hot and kind of inedible. So you end up not really being able to harvest anything in the summer. Now you've got another empty garden plot. Tomatoes are the same way. They actually will stop setting fruit. The flowers will not be able to be pollinated if it's over, I believe, 85 degrees. We've been over 85 degrees for a minute now. So tomatoes aren't producing, cucumbers aren't producing, corn is done, and you have other single harvest crops, kind of like bush beans, where they put on a big flush of beans and then they're done, versus pole beans, which will continue to produce throughout the year, however, do drastically slow down in the heat. So that's where I am right now. My beans, they look fantastic. I'm not really producing much right now. I harvested my corn. Pest and disease has started to take my squash, and disease has taken most of my tomatoes. So I've got a lot of open space. Doesn't mean the garden year is over. Not at all. So along with the pole beans I planted at the beginning of the year, I also planted bush beans. You can see they're kind of mottled. They're getting a little bit diseased. That's a type of rust that eventually attacks all beans. But while they're still producing a little bit, for the most part, there's not much left. Some of them don't long for this world much longer. And since bush beans are kind of that one and done crop, you get that big flush, that big harvest right away, and then they just kind of peter out, I went ahead and planted more. And those seeds are starting to come up. It's perfect timing too, because even though my pole beans look like they're doing absolutely fantastic, there's really not a whole lot in there. It's just been so hot that they can't keep up, and when they do set, the beans are kind of like, I don't know, dehydrated, I guess. So right now, I'm not harvesting many beans, and I probably won't be for a little while from these pole beans, until it starts to cool down a little bit, or at least we get a break in this heat wave. So I've got a few, but overall, considering how many plants I have, 7 on this side, 6 on this side, you'd expect to be getting a lot more. And by succession sowing my bush beans, those are really quick to produce. They are really quick to germinate, reach maturity, and produce. So I'll get beans while I'm waiting for these to get their act back together. I also have this garden bed that is completely empty. This is where my corn used to be. Harvested the corn. Now we can succession sow corn in my area. Some areas the season's just too short. But for my area, we generally don't succession sow corn just because the pest pressure that goes after corn in the second half of the year is insane. It's almost not worth the effort. So I'm gonna plant something else there. You see, this used to be where all my tomatoes were. and disease took out every single one except this tiny little cherry tomato. Now for stuff with bigger seeds like beans and squash, you can just direct sow those in the ground. If you do have roly-polies or slugs, you may want to cover them with something to protect them when they're tiny little seedlings, or just start them in separate containers until they're large enough to transplant and handle a little bit of pest pressure. But for stuff like tomatoes, such tiny seeds and such delicate seedlings, you want to start those in containers. Since it's warm outside, I'm not starting them indoors. I'm actually just starting them on my patio, but it is in seed starting mix where I can closely monitor the moisture level of the soil, and when they're big enough, they'll get transplanted into the garden. We have a long enough growing season where with tomatoes we can do that here because they perform best late spring, early summer, and fall into early winter because it gets so hot here, and they don't like the heat. So where I have my corn is where my tomatoes are going to go, because that bed, I don't want the disease that took out the tomatoes I planted earlier in the year affecting my fall tomatoes. So they're going to be going in a spot that has never seen tomatoes before. Now, I personally don't grow cucumbers. They would go to waste. I'd make pickles and that's probably about it, and not worth it to me to dedicate a space in my garden for those right now. But cucumbers are one of those things, they'll get really bitter when it gets hot, so they're great spring crops and great fall crops. Right now, at least for my area, you'd probably be starting cucumber seeds in the next 3 weeks or so, once it's really peak summer, really hot out. But you don't have to worry about the heat when you're starting the seeds because they're not producing. Once they start producing, it should be around fall. So timing's kind of everything. And I have noticed that pest pressure on my squash, pardon the flooding, it just rained all day here. But pest pressure has taken out a few of my squash, so we're kind of empty up in here in a few places, and it's getting very thin, whereas this was very lush before. So I have started direct sowing some squash seeds. Squash are another one of those really fast to germinate, mature, and produce crops. So it's succession planting. Timing is everything. You want to take a look at how long, if you're planting from seeds, like date to maturity, when the plant is going to start producing. And make sure, one, you have that many days left. Say you have something that says 80 days until date of maturity. That means from the time you plant the seed to the time the plant starts to produce will take 80 days. Now you have to think about how long will it take for what it's producing to mature to be harvestable. Tack on a few more days for that. And how much of a harvest do you want from this? Do you just want one and then your first frost comes and then you're all done? Or do you want to be harvesting for a while? So figure out what your last frost date is for your area. Find out what you're planting or what you plan on planting, how long that takes to get to maturity, and how long it'll be able to grow after it reaches maturity. And see if you have enough time to get anything out of it. For a lot of people who have shorter growing seasons, they'll start seeds well before they even have space open for them. Just because by the time the plant's mature enough to go into the garden, they will have space. And at that point, if it's mature enough to go in the garden, it's pretty close to being mature enough to produce. And you will have enough season left. So timing is everything. Now most seed packets have the date on the back of it, or how many days to maturity on the back of it. You could also buy started plants if you can find them locally. I know around here, not really much is being sold for started plants right now. That's usually more of a beginning of the season thing. You can search your first and last frost date on the Old Farmer's Almanac online. Sorry, I'm getting eaten alive out here. That rain brought in all the mosquitoes. But once you find your first and last frost date, you'll know how long your planting season is, how much time you have left. And if you don't have enough time left this year to start succession sowing, now you're prepared for next year. So I can't really tell you when, oh, little hummingbird, But I can't really tell you when to start planting, when to start direct sowing seeds, when to start starting seeds in containers or indoors. That's going to be solely based on your growing season, your location, the weather in your area. But for the most part, a lot of things have a second season. Just because your plant didn't survive through the whole summer, through the whole growing season, doesn't mean that your garden is done. Doesn't mean you're done getting beans. Doesn't mean you're done getting cucumbers. It just means that you might be done for a month or two. For a short period of time until the next wave of plants become mature, when the weather is more ideal for them. So don't think you have to let that empty space go to waste. There's something you can plant. And if it's towards the end of the season, you might want to consider doing your fall crops. Your brassicas, your lettuces, your Brussels sprouts, and cauliflowers. But it's never too late for something. It's hard to believe that it's actually almost... It's July. It's middle of July. I'm gonna have to start thinking about carrots soon. Well, anyway, thank you for joining me. I hope that advice helped. If you have any questions, let me know. And I'll see you next time.